Hello. You can't do that. It's anachronistic. That's a thing that I've thankfully never heard levelled at me, and I think I know exactly why. But it is a complaint that people have about fantasy settings, and as a fantasy author, I want to talk about it. So if you haven't been here before, hi, I'm Will. I write books for a living. That's what I do. Mostly sci-fi and fantasy. I say mostly every time. It's entirely sci-fi and fantasy books, with a focus on LGBT, queer, and disabled characters being included, because queer and disabled people want to go on quests and explore space too, and why shouldn't we? But basically, I wanted to talk about anachronism in fantasy because it's on my mind a lot at the minute, which is wild because I am I'm not writing anything where anachronism could be levelled at me, but people have been in my sphere, in my general internet locale, and been talking about anachronism in fantasy, and anachronism on like a couple of different fronts. So we are going to try and cover all of those. So we're going to talk about like what actually is anachronism and what people mean when they say anachronism in a fantasy setting, and why they think that anachronism is the right word, and the fact that there isn't a better word. And then I will try and go through each of the things that have been bothering me about it. I have tried to make this video already once and I got completely off on a tangent for like 20 minutes. So this is a remake and hopefully I won't do that again. And if you're seeing this, I probably haven't. So what is anachronism, right? Well, basically it is when you're doing a period piece, a historical piece of some kind. So let's use, I don't know, Pride and Prejudice, because who doesn't like Pride and Prejudice? And you've got you're doing an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. You're adapting it for TV or film or heck, even a game. And you have to make sure that everything fits with the period that Pride and Prejudice is actually set in, right? You have to have them in the right clothes, you have to have them talking with the right manners and the right language. If you change up the way that they speak, sometimes that upsets people because it's anachronistic. It doesn't match the pattern of the time. And we very clearly can see what the pattern of the time was in something like Pride and Prejudice because it was written in the era that it's set in, right? It was a contemporary piece back then. And it's really important a lot of the time in proper historical settings, to the extent that when I was writing my pirate novels, a map. When I was writing my pirate novels, I was getting so far away from actual historical settings that I decided I was going to create a whole new universe instead, and instead of having it be a historical fantasy novel, I made it a pseudo-historical fantasy novel instead, where we have a pretend world that sounds a lot like our world and acts a lot like our world, and so much of it matches up with real historical pieces, but it's also kind of a hodgepodge together historical thing. So like some of it's Regency era and some of it's Golden Age of piracy and some of it's Victorian era and a bit steampunky, and also sirens are real. And I decided to do that because I knew that I was stepping too far outside the bounds of what would be considered a reasonable step outside the bounds of historical fantasy, right? That was a personal decision, and it is entirely a personal decision for every single person who does it. And also, I know that my standards are really specific because I have a BA in classical studies, which is a historical subject. So, and my wife is an archaeologist, also, that's important too. So, when it comes to anachronism, that's what it is historically speaking. Anachronism in fantasy usually falls under one of two actual subcategories of anachronism, which is basically, if we imagine it as like someone in Pride and Prejudice adaptation is wearing a digital watch. You notice the digital watch, you're looking at it and you're thinking, they can't be wearing that. They don't have that in this time period. Completely fair, that's anachronism. If you then translate that to fantasy, there's two ways to interpret that digital watch. There is, I think that the trappings of this world are medieval-esque or Regency-esque or whatever historical period. Usually it's medieval-esque. That's what people think because there's a whole Lord of the Rings thing going on. Should we pause for that? We'll pause for that. The whole Lord of the Ring thing going on there is basically the same thing that happened with dystopian lit and the Hunger Games, where Lord of the Rings is this massively well-known fantasy thing, right? And a lot of things that came after its huge success and popularity, and it's had several like bouts of huge popularity, because there was the original books, and then there was the original movies, and then there was the Hobbit movies, and now there's a whole new TV series. Like, these are strategic bouts of popularity, and every time Lord of the Rings gets popular again, stuff around it becomes like a big thing again. So people start making fantasy, or publishing fantasy if they've already made it, or publicizing the fantasy that they have already published that looks kind of like Lord of the Rings, because they can use it as a comparative title again. And whether it's accurately like Lord of the Rings or not, it doesn't actually matter. What matters is whether it has that vibe of Lord of the Rings, or the vibe that people think of when they think of Lord of the Rings. And what most people think of when they think of Lord of the Rings is they think of like the plate armor and elves and dwarves and mines and spiders and, you know, the aesthetic. So when it comes to a fantasy character wearing a digital watch, there is this element of, I'm expecting something that looks like the Lord of the Rings, which is a very medieval-esque fantasy. It's got the trappings of the medieval era, even though it's not a real place, not set in a real time period. So if a character in something like Lord of the Rings was wearing a digital watch, it wouldn't make sense. But the first block is, I'm expecting it to look like Lord of the Rings, and therefore the digital watch doesn't make sense. And the second block is, I'm expecting it to look like Lord of the Rings. It does look like Lord of the Rings, and I don't understand why this character is wearing a digital watch, because you, the author, haven't explained it properly. For example, I could have a character wearing a digital watch and explain that actually it's not digital, it's magical. It's a magical watch that's like powered by crystals and the moon or whatever. You know, as long as you have an internal consistency, logical reason for it to exist, that's fine. And it doesn't vibe as anachronistic to most people, except for those people that fall in the middle camp. But the problem with the middle camp is that's usually where we find our problems, and it's most of where I'm going to be focusing. This is not just about digital watches. Shockingly enough, it's actually more detailed than that. And if you've been here before, you might have noticed that on my channel I have a sort of ongoing series called How to Write LGBT Characters and Why You Should Anyway. By sort of ongoing, I mean it's not finished, I haven't closed it, I just haven't added to it for a while because I haven't had any thoughts and time. Although, to be fair, this may well end up in that playlist, because I am going to be talking about LGBT characters in it, and I think it's relevant and important to discuss. So when it comes to I don't like it anachronism, which is what I'm going to call this middle thing, like whether it's I was expecting something from your pitch that, like, if it's, no, not whether it's, if it's something like I was expecting something different from your pitch and I'm disappointed by what's ended up being the case, I feel like that falls into the you haven't explained it properly camp. Whereas that I don't like it anachronism is I was expecting something different regardless of what you said, and therefore I don't like it, and I think it's anachronistic or doesn't fit the setting that I was expecting it to have, right? And herein lies most of the problem that people have with including, oh, I don't know, any minority character ever. This is where that problem generally lies, is that I was expecting it to look like Lord of the Rings. Please name for me one character who is not cis, straight, white, mostly male. I know people can name female characters in Lord of the Rings, so I'm not going to list that one. And able-bodied. I'll wait. I'm not actually waiting because I can't actually hear you. But the point is that it's very difficult at best to name more than 3 women characters in Lord of the Rings. Are there more than 3 women characters in Lord of the Rings? And I'm not trying to dig at Lord of the Rings. I completely understand the context of that novel, series, whatever. I completely understand the context of it. It's a war story, right? This is a guy processing his own trauma through a fantasy story. Of course it's mostly men. He went to war with men. My granddad did the same thing. Like, them's the shakes. It's a war story. Of course it looks like that. Of course it reflects back the world that Tolkien was living in and experiencing and processing. In the same way that, hey, most of my books are very heavy on the queer characters. Would you like to know why? It's because all of my friends are queer. Because I'm queer. It's because my whole social circle is queer. That's why. But when it comes down to it, a lot of the problem that people have in these fantasies where they talk about anachronism is that they were expecting something that looks like Lord of the Rings, which was made in this very specific context, and they've not looked at the context, they've just looked at the surface trappings, right? Completely fair. I'm not saying everyone has to look at the context of everything you read every single time. That would be very tiring. Context is important when you're doing analysis, but if you're not doing analysis and you're just reading for fun, then you're just reading for fun and you don't need to do the analysis part unless that is something that's fun for you, right? Right. So a lot of the time, these are the same people. Like, it's the people who don't want to think hard about these things, and they shouldn't have to if they don't want to, but then they cry anachronism because they're struggling with the idea that it doesn't look the way that they were expecting, because they were expecting something that looks on a surface level like Lord of the Rings. I feel like I've belabored that point. Beleaguered? Beleaguered. I feel like I've belabored that point enough now. So here are the 3 problems I've been coming up against. Number 1, why are none of your elves brown skinned? I just don't get it. I don't understand it. When it comes to the Guardian Cadet series, I told you I was going to talk about that. When it comes to the Guardian Cadet series, there are 3 types of elves. They're fantasy, so it's okay. There are 3 types of elves. There are blue elves who are very pale skinned and have blue undertones. They bleed blue, they've got blue eyes, they've got pale hair and pale skin. Them's are blue elves. We have gold elves who have gold undertones. They bleed gold, their eyes are gold, their hair is usually gold, which is not always, it doesn't always line up line for line. And they're supposed to give you the impression of anywhere from like a typically East Asian skin tone through West Asian, all the way to like Hispanic, all the way including Hispanic, that kind of golden brown skin tone, right? And then you have your red elves as the 3rd category of elf. Your red elves, again, it's all pretty much the same. They've got red eyes, they bleed red, they have red undertones, and usually these guys have really dark skin. Because that's the world that I have built. Those were decisions that I have made. And I stand by them because I think it's cool. I think that's a cool system. Goblins in the universe have gemstone coloured skin and hair. And sometimes that looks very like Earth human, and sometimes it really doesn't. And them's the shakes. But basically, my elves, 2/3 of my elves have brown skin. Because that was the world I wanted to build. And that is what my world looks like outside my house. When I leave my house to go to the shop or to travel to MCM Comic Con in October, or wherever or when I'm walking my dog, or wherever I happen to be going at any given time, when I walk out of the house, that's what my world looks like. About 1/3 of each of these categories of skin tone. I know I live in a very diverse area, but that's what it looks like to me. So I have reflected that in my fantasy novel and most of my other novels. And people will cry anachronism when they see a brown-skinned elf or when they see a brown-skinned character in a fantasy setting. People did it really dramatically when it came to the Witcher TV series, which was very upsetting because there's no logic there. Like, again, if you're looking at the context within which it was written, it's written by a Polish author, right? I've never been to Poland, but I did host Polish exchange students for a while when I was a kid. And they'll admit freely, all of those Polish exchange students admitted freely that there aren't a lot of people of colour in Poland. There's not none, but you're looking at a vast majority of white people. So of course, when you're writing a book that reflects the world around you, just like I did, where my world is very diverse, if you are in a very low diversity area or country, of course your books aren't going to look like that. But there's no reason that that needs to be held onto when you're adapting to screen, unless it's relevant. And again, I'm going to speak about relevance. So for example, if we were adapting Mary Ellen Breaking the Curse to screen, which I hope one day happens, because I think it would make it more accessible to people, and that would be great. But ultimately, whatever, right? But if you're adapting Mary Ellen Breaking the Curse to screen, one thing that would be really important is not making sure that whoever plays Mary is a white person with blonde hair and blue eyes. That's not the important part. The important part is matching whoever plays Mary with whoever plays the two villains in the story. I'm not going to say who they are because that's a big spoiler. But the two villains in the story, they have to look like Mary. So whoever you cast to play Mary, you have to cast these two to match. It does not matter that Mary is supposed to be white with blue eyes and blonde hair, like really pale blonde hair. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that these two villains are supposed to be white with blue eyes and really pale blonde hair. Does not matter. That's not relevant. What's relevant is all three of these people look like each other. That's the thing that matters. Everything else is negotiable. But I also don't think it's reasonable to casually change that. Like, not unreasonable. I also don't think it's necessary, I guess, actually, is what I'm trying to say. I don't think it's necessary to change that because the setting of the Guardian Cadet series is already so intentionally diverse when it comes to skin tones, right? Like I've already described that there are these three different kinds of elves, that goblins have these gemstone skin tones, but also when it comes to humans, they're not all white either. We've got Petey is white, Calic is not, Commander Wickley is not. Who else is a human in this novel? Who else is a human in this novel? Oh, Al Jenkins is not. Do I have a single white human? Is this one of those like moments where I realise there are no white people in my novel? Well, there are white people. There are white elves and there are white goblins, but I don't think I included a single white human. It's probably fine. It's fine. No, wait, Petey is white, isn't he? Yes, Petey is white. He is. There is at least one. It's fine. He's the token white guy. It's not important. Moving on. Like, I don't think it would be necessary to include more people of colour to reflect the real world that we actually live in, or the world that we want to portray for people on screen, or the world that, like, the world in which the best actor for the job gets the job, regardless of what's going on with their background, their ethnicity, their skin tone, whatever. And obviously that's not true in all cases. In some cases it's really important that a character's ethnicity or skin tone or whatever be maintained, right? Sometimes that's really important and other times it's not. And I think that the vast majority of fantasy novels, it's not that important. Like, there are definitely moments that are important. There are things, pieces that are important. Like, again, using the Guardian Cadet series, it's important that the Brotherhood of Guardians does not accept women, that there are no women in the Brotherhood of Guardians, and that Mary is a woman. Those are important plot-based pieces. Mary's ethnicity actually is very important. Mary's skin tone isn't important, except in that it's supposed to match these villains. That's relevant, that's important, it's necessary. That's all there is to it. And I think people do have this problem with seeing people of colour in novels, fantasy novels especially. And it's weird and it's racist. And I don't think people necessarily realise that it's racist or that they're being racist by asking the question of why these characters are not white. They're just used to seeing the world a certain way and media presentations of the world a certain way. So it becomes a jarring concept for them to come up against a world that doesn't present itself like that. But it is still racist. Just because it's not intentional doesn't mean it's not actually. And it's something that if you have said that about a book before, it's something you need to think about. Why did you say that? Why did you have that thought process? And that's only something that you can figure out for yourself, I'm afraid. The second thing that we come up against very often is whether it is specifically including queer characters at all, which I'm not really going to address because queer people exist and I'm tired of not saying it, and that's pretty much all I have to say on the subject. Or whether it's having queer people use modern terms, which I will actually be talking about. So when it's having queer people use modern terms, I understand a lot more where we're coming from. And also I worry that we're falling into, again, traps, right? So I understand where you're coming from. If you feel like in your setting or with your specific character, they wouldn't casually be there like, hello, I'm bi. Like my love interest, actually both of my main character and her love interest in Mary Ellen Breaking the Curse are both bi, right? They are bi. Bi erasure. My heart breaks. Anyway, so Mary and her love interest are both bi, and the love interest specifically actively comes out on the page in a way that Mary really should have, and then I completely forgot to include. But she does have a moment in book 2, so I suppose it's forgivable. And I really did think it was clear enough when she talks about her best friend, but we'll get to that in a minute. So the love interest has the moment where he's hitting on Mary. He's trying to confess his attraction. And he says, I thought I would like a partner like my brother's partners, except he's straight and I'm decidedly not. Like, he doesn't say the word bisexual. He also doesn't say the word bisexual in book 2. Nobody actually says the word bisexual on page. Because it didn't vibe with his character to say it. I didn't think he would say it that way. It didn't make sense for his character. And I know I get to decide what the characters do and say, but by that point, he's a well-established character and it just doesn't make sense for him to say the words, I'm bi. But it does make sense for him to clarify at length about how he's different from his brother and the way that this comparison has existed in his head. And at the same time, earlier in the book, he asks Mary if she's ever contemplated dating her best friend, who is non-binary and uses they them pronouns. No, that's not true. I was about to say neo-pronouns and it came out wrong. No, Mary's best friend is non-binary and uses neo-pronouns she and them with the X. And the love interest asks Mary if she's ever contemplated dating this character. And Mary says no, because Leor, the best friend, is aromantic. And she uses the word aromantic because you absolutely can use modern terminology for identity labels in fantasy settings. You absolutely can. It's completely reasonable. It's not jarring. It's not weird. A lot of the idea that it's weird and jarring comes from the baked-in queerphobia that we all live with all the time. I'm sorry to be the one to break it to you if you hadn't figured that one out on your own, but it's true. Sorry. But when it comes down to it, that is the case most of the time. A lot of the time when we're talking about not wanting to use modern terminology and modern labels in fantasy settings, not historical ones, fantasy ones, it's because queerphobia. But I do understand that it's not always the vibe. Like I said, it's not the vibe with Calic. So I love that people do make these lists. I just worry that like when we make these lists, we accidentally fall into the same trap of like being sort of historically homophobic and transphobic and queerphobic in general by describing them in alternate ways. And I'm not saying that queer people can't describe their models of attraction or their lives in non-typical or non-labelistic ways. Absolutely can. And also when it comes to being a character in a book, it's slightly different because they're not real. And also, I think there's definitely an element here of you can have a character say, yes, I'd love to date you, and I should let you know that sex is not on the table. We're not going to have it. I'm not doing that. And that can be, I'm asexual, but it can just be, I don't like the sound of it. It hurts me. I swore a vow of chastity. Whatever. Like, there's loads of different reasons that can exist. And I think there's the risk of not being clear enough. So, just be aware of that. But I do, again, think that, like, this is the thing. I didn't want to come on here and be there like, oh, by the way, the reason that people think anachronism exists in fantasy is racism, queerphobia, and ableism. That's the next thing we're going to get to. But as I'm talking, I'm realising that that's what I'm saying. Not all of it. Again, some of it is that third thing. You didn't make this make sense in the setting as the author. As the author, you have failed to make this make sense in the setting. But a lot of it is not that. And a lot of the conversations around it are not that either. And we are going to get to the whammy of it, which is the ableism one. And I really hope you're going to stick around for the ableism one, because it's really important to me. And it's really important in general. So I hope you're going to stick around for that. Here we go. There is this concept in both sci-fi and fantasy, actually in sci-fi as well as fantasy, but there is this concept in fantasy settings, whether it's novels or tabletop gaming settings, that having a disabled character is anachronistic, because either, and this is just so depressing, either they'd be dead, or they wouldn't be going on a quest, or with magical healing, why wouldn't they be healed? And it's like, okay, so two big things here. One, what the fuck? And two, it's because we're trying to reflect the world that we actually live in, and disabled people exist and deserve to see themselves in stories. But also, there are plenty of disabled characters in stories. Like, again, in Mariella Breaking the Curse, this is not really a spoiler. Over the course of the first novel, she becomes disabled because something happens. I'm not going to say what, that's why it's not a spoiler. Something happens to her dominant left arm, and she can't use it to the same extent that she wants to be able to use it, that any normal person, any able-bodied person would be able to use their dominant arm. It hurts all the time, and it doesn't function the way it's supposed to. That is, according to my wife at the very least, disabling. Some of us did not realise that because we are used to our limbs just not functioning when they fancy not functioning. But apparently that is actually a disability, as much as my doctors have been gaslighting me for the past 17 years. Anyway, I'm having fun with it. I hope you'll have fun with me. Anyway, the other part of it that really bugs me is this whole conversation usually ends up being like, a disabled person can't go on a quest because they're disabled. How would you get a wheelchair up a set of stairs? And it's always the wheelchair that stumps people for some reason, like as if there aren't other disabilities. But like, how could you get a wheelchair up a set of stairs? Is the villain's lair going to be OSHA compliant now? And it's like, I don't know what OSHA is. It might be ADA compliant. I don't know what they mean. But basically, there would be stairs in a villain's lair. That's the best way to get rid of a hero who's in a wheelchair, right? Or they should be fully magically healed, right? And I don't know how they haven't put the most logical things together, which is this person's in a wheelchair because real people deserve to see themselves in novels, and real people use wheelchairs. And also, the dream of a lot of wheelchair users is not to be able to walk again. The dream of a lot of wheelchair users is a magic enchantment that lets them climb the stairs in their wheelchair. Which is what I did in the Guardian Cadet series. I didn't mention it until book 2 because it doesn't become relevant until book 2 when we meet the Elven Queen, Cariella. Cariella is in a wheelchair. She is a full-time wheelchair user. It does not matter why. In the form of, you never find out. I know why, but you don't need to know why. It's not actually important to the story, so I didn't include why. All that matters is that she is in a wheelchair, full-time, all the time. Did you mind? She is in a wheelchair, full-time, all the time. And there is a conversation that Mary overhears about how Cariella has been instating ramps in the Elven Palace because she is tired of having to use the magical enchantments that get up and down the stairs, because magic can be tampered with in a way that a ramp often can't be. And they don't think it's important or necessary because they're ableists. They don't think it's important or necessary because they can't see the purpose for it. But the person they're talking to makes the point that, hey, maybe it's because like magic can be tampered with. Can you imagine being at the top of the stairs and not being able to come down, or at the bottom of the stairs and not being able to go up just because somebody cast a no magic zone over the stairs for a bit? Pants. Rubbish, right? Not to mention, this is the Elven Queen we're talking about. She needs to be able to get around, because if someone's trying to assassinate her and the easiest way to do it is to trap her at the top or bottom of a set of stairs, that's too easy. Like, she's the queen. We've got to protect her. So, you know, these are conversations to be had, but it just boggles my mind that people can't understand that it's not anachronistic to have disabled people in fantasy, because, you know, two reasons. One is that disabled people exist in the real world, and we are reflecting that back largely when we do fantasy and sci-fi and other novels. And two, magical healing doesn't mean that they have to get completely healed. Like, again, in the Guardian Cadet series, Mary loses complete use of her dominant left arm, and it cannot be fully magically healed because it's a magical piece of damage, right? And also because, well, not also, and also because it's not actually about Mary's arm anymore, but also in the setting that I have devised in the Guardian Cadet series, if someone was born or became disabled and they were quite happy with the life that they were leading and they didn't feel the need to go looking for potential magical cures, then they just get to exist, right? They're not forced to get better by some random standpoint that we apparently should all be aiming towards. There's not some pinnacle of existence that we're all aiming towards, that every person in a setting with magical healing should be striving towards and therefore match and meet. That's a Nazi talking point. Well, yes, but that's just not reasonable or realistic. A disabled person can go on a quest. There are so many disabilities. Like, diabetes is a disability, because if it's not treated, it kills you, because you have to manage it, because it interferes with your daily life and the way that you lead your daily life. But there's no reason a person with diabetes wouldn't be able to go on a quest as long as they can take their meds with them and the people around them know how to help take care of them as necessary, right? There's no reason that a person who has one arm would not be able to go on a quest, because why would that stop them? You know? And people will cry it's anachronistic to have a wheelchair. And okay, I can see where you're coming from. Wheelchairs as a concept, as a thing, have only existed for rats, I used to know how long. But we see them be developed within history. We see it happen. Wheelchairs are not a thing until, I want to say, like Regency Victorian era, but I'm not exactly sure, so don't hold me to that. And even then, when they become a thing that exists, they are largely used in hospital settings and for high-class people, which, to be fair, mostly high-class people are going to hospital settings anyway. But people haven't been able to walk for the entire history of time. Humanity has existed with disabilities since literally the beginning of humanity. We have physical evidence of this, archaeological evidence of this being true. We have evidence that people had broken bones that took a long time to heal, or were completely, were injured to such an extent that they would not have been able to take care of themselves. We have historical evidence that these people lived decades after that injury or disability existence. We have evidence of chunks of people who had Down syndrome, who lived happy and healthy lives for elongated periods of time, even if we can see in the archaeological evidence whether or not they would have been able to take care of themselves, whether or not they would have needed complete care full time forever. Elders are taken care of in pre-farming civilization. And this idea that we would just kill or leave behind or leave to die people who need our care is so alienating to me, because it's not in the historical evidence. When you look at the actual historical evidence, we have, again, records and physical evidence of people existing with disabling conditions in all periods of history. So how do people with partial paralysis, or who cannot walk for any variety of reasons, how do they live and exist and get around and contribute to their family lives, right, in a period before a wheelchair exists? Well, 3 main ways. 1, they stay home. It's not exciting, but it's true, because even if you have partial paralysis or you can't walk or whatever, you can still do a lot of things. You can watch a stew pot, you can do some spinning. Spinning is very easy when you know how to do it. It's hard to learn, but it's easy when you know how to do it. You only need one hand to do spinning with a drop spindle, and we've had drop spindles since, again, as soon as we started making woolen goods. This has been a thing for such a long time. So they either stay at home and do homemaking activities, and activities that can be done at home. They take care of the house, they take care of the toddlers, they take care of, whoever they can in whatever way they can. Or even if they're not useful and productive, their family still loves them and takes care of them anyway. If they are more able-bodied, except for this inability to walk, maybe they get carried around. This is a thing that I have also seen evidence for in historical stuff. People get carried around. Like you get your burly friends on each side of you, you sit on a plank of wood, they carry you around. If you're an emperor, you go in a palanquin. It's there's so many options, there's so many ways to move around the world without having to use your legs. And that's always the one that people think of. They always think of wheelchairs and they always think that it's anachronistic. But you could ride on a fucking cow. There's so many things you could do. And in a setting that is fantastical, why wouldn't you have a hover chair? Why wouldn't you be there it'd be really convenient if someone would make a way that I could move around while sitting in a chair. And if you're in a fantasy world where magic exists, surely someone could magic that into reality. Or you could just include a normal wheelchair, because it's not actually historical, is it? We've had this conversation already in this video. It's not actually a historical piece, it's fantasy. You can do what you want. Now, I'm not saying with any of this that you personally, if you're an author or a creator of media, I'm not saying that you personally must include people from diverse racial backgrounds and disabled people and queer people. I would question why you wouldn't want to, because I don't understand it. But I'm not demanding you do any of these things. All I'm saying is the conversation around anachronism is largely based in bigotry. And there are pieces where it's relevant. This character is wearing a digital watch and it's supposed to be the Regency era. This is an actual historical piece and they're not holding the actuality of historical stuff. But even then, a lot of the time, sorry, this is definitely a tangent, but even then, a lot of the time, there's loads of stuff in these historical pieces that isn't actually historical, because it's got to be what we call pop culture historical, which is the historical that a layman would understand. But as soon as you ask an expert on something, whether they think it's good or accurate or not, they're going to say no. I am an absolute nightmare. So like I said, or maybe I didn't say, like I've said before, I have a BA in classical studies, right? I studied ancient Greece, classical Greece, and ancient Rome as my university degree. That's what I have a degree in. I have a lot of other qualifications, but that's the one that's relevant to this conversation. My wife is an archaeologist. She has a master's degree in archaeology, and she was a commercial archaeologist for a long time, and then she worked in heritage, and I'm not talking about what she does now. Because it's not important and it's not relevant, and because private lives are private and all that jazz. But so I have this really condensed view of stuff. But what I'm trying to say is that I have this really specific understanding of the ancient world, right? And I did an art and architecture module several times over. Not the same module. I like ancient Greek art and architecture. Specifically architecture, actually. I'm such a big nerd about old buildings, like ancient buildings. And also we did a thing where we looked at the British romanticization of ancient Greek buildings and the way that reinterprets and kind of changes. And this is actually really relevant now that I think about it. It is a tangent, but it is relevant. But the way that British buildings in their 1800s emulated these ancient Greek buildings, because there was this mania about it back then, and about how those reinterpretations don't actually match up, but have become what people think of when, especially British people, obviously, when they think of these ancient buildings. So a properly ancient classical building has what we call, and don't worry if you don't follow me on this, just stick with me until the end of it. We have what we call Doric columns, right? And you can tell if they're really ancient or not by whether they're donuts stacked on top of each other or one huge thing of marble, right? A huge giant column of marble is the original way that people did this. They have no base, they're flat to the ground, they have 3 steps below, and then above them they have the connection point, what's it called, the top of the column, I can't remember right now, and that's very annoying. They have the top of the column that connects it to the building above, and above that they have these things called triglyphs and metopes, and then above that they have the triangle thingy, which is, I can't remember what that's called either, this is so embarrassing. And then they have the roof, right? That's not actually, it's not hugely relevant, but whether I can remember these terms or not. I know what they are, it just escapes my brain right now. It's very hot here right now. But anyway, the reason that triglyphs and metopes exist is that a triglyph is designed to look like 3 pieces of wood from original wooden temples, right? They're emulating their own previous style. And a metope is a designed square piece of marble. When that style of, and this is a game I play with my wife, she doesn't enjoy it, but I do. Game I play with my wife where we'll go around, especially like London, which really has that like mania about it. We'll go around there and I'll point at columns and I'll be like, what's wrong with that column? And she'll be like, oh God, here we go. But it's fun for me, so she puts up with it because she loves me, because she does the same thing with church bricks. But anyway, that's not relevant. But I'll point at a column and I'll say, what's wrong with this? And she'll look at it and she'll go, tell me what kind of column it is. And I'll say, for example, Doric, because I've just explained what a Doric column is and what it's supposed to look like. And she'll look at this Doric column and she'll be like, it has a base? And yes, it has a base. It shouldn't, because it's a Doric column. Or I'll point at a different column and it will be an Ionic column. Not relevant, not important. All you need to know is that an Ionic column does not have triglyphs and metopes atop it. It has a thing called a frieze, which is one long strip of decorated marble. All that's relevant. And I'll point at that and I'll be like, what's wrong with this column? And she'll say, what kind of column is it? And I'll say, it's an Ionic column. You should know this by now. It's been 10 years. And she'll be like, oh, sorry, I just don't care. And then I'll be like, okay, so what's wrong with it? And she'll look at it and she'll go, I don't know. And I'll say, it's not got a frieze over the top of it. It's got triglyphs and metopes. And it shouldn't, because that's not historically accurate. And she's like, okay, but like this isn't an actual historical building. And that's exactly my point. I still get frustrated when these columns aren't right. I don't like it. It bugs me. Because I care about columns in a way that no normal person does. But I care about columns. I think they're cool and I think they're fascinating and I could talk about them for days, except apparently not with the right terminology when it's too hard to think. But other people don't care about it. And the thing is that these columns on these buildings, particularly in London, they're not designed to match exactly the historical accuracy of the column. They're not even made out of the right stuff most of the time. They're not designed to be a perfect emulation. They're designed to be inspired by it. And when it comes down to it, a fantasy setting that's based in a medieval aesthetic or an ancient Greek aesthetic or whatever other historical period aesthetic, like my pirate books, which are based in a Regency Victorian Golden Age of Piracy aesthetic, they're not actually based in the time period. They're not actually trying to look exactly right. They're not trying to not be anachronistic. They're trying to give you a good story and a fun world, or an interesting world, for it to be set in. And I think we all need to get maybe a little bit more comfortable with the idea that it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be interesting. And if you're not interested, you could read a different book. Like, I got some feedback on my first pirate novel, Not the Fighting Kind, which is the sort of burgundy one up there. The green one next to it is the sequel, which is came out in September. Came out in September. This is posting after that. And it's not historically accurate. But like, I got some feedback on it where somebody said this didn't vibe for me because the way you sold it didn't match to me with what I read. And I said, okay, cool, it's too late to change that now. Let me fix my pitch instead. And I did, and people have liked it so far. But that was really necessary because I was pitching it wrong. Because I was pitching it in a way that emphasized the world state, and I'll be honest, I don't really do that much gifting of world building to people. I don't spend a lot of time on it because it's something that I love to do for my own worlds, but I don't love to read it in other people's books. So I don't want to make people have to read it in my books. Like, I'd be happy to talk about my worlds for hours on end, but it's not relevant to the story. So it doesn't need to be there. But for some people, it does need to be there. And I think that if it just doesn't vibe for you, that's kind of fine. Like, my pirate books, Not the Fighting Kind, just didn't vibe for this person, and that is fine. It hurts when you get the feedback because you don't like hearing that people don't like your stuff. You pour a lot of work into a book, and if somebody's there like, I didn't like it, it's like, okay, that's nice. This is like 3 years of my life. But ultimately, if you don't like the book, you're allowed to just put it down and pick a book that you might like more. I'm never going to read The Lord of the Rings. I can't get through those lengthy paragraphs of description. I think the story's great, but I just can't make it through. I can't manage it. And that's okay. And it's okay if you don't like books. And it's okay if you don't like books because you think anachronism or not vibing with the setting that you were expecting or the setting that you got given is a problem for you. That's fine. But just be aware that if you're calling it anachronistic because it's got people of colour or disabled people or queer people in it, that's probably not actually fair. Anyway, I hope you found this entertaining. It took a long time because I had those 3 huge points to get through, so I hope you did stick around to the end. If you do want to read my books, they're probably faster than this. You can find all the info you need about them in the description box below with a link to my website, because I know no one can spell my name anyway, but that is where all the information is from what is most recent from me or what is coming up next, and all of that jazz. And if you're watching this as it comes out, I am going to MCM Comic Con in October. If you have tickets, I would love to see you there. If you don't have tickets, you can still buy them, I think. I'm not sure. I'm not a representative of MCM Comic Con, but I will have a table and I will be selling my books at that table. I will be selling my short story zines as well, including my smutty pirate zines that you can only get from me in person, because every single platform online apparently has a problem with not safe for work content. And these are smutty pirate stories. It's not safe for work. Anyway, and then beyond that, I guess I will see you next time. Bye.